This edition of MacVoices is sponsored by ProXPN, the virtual private network service. Protect your internet by securing your connection and get up to 50% off by visiting proxpn.com and using the offer code VOICES. And by Smile, the makers of PDF Pen for Mac, PDF Pen Pro for Mac, PDF Pen for iPhone and iPad, PDF Pen Scan Plus for iPhone and iPad, Text Expander for Mac, Text Expander for iPhone and iPad, and Disc Label. Find out more about all their great products at smilesoftware.com. Welcome to Mac Voices. This is the talk of the Mac community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, I've been contemplating doing an upgrade to my iTunes library, going back and re-ripping, I should say, a lot of CDs to lossless format to improve the quality. But the more I started to think about it, the more questions that came up. And so I thought, we're going to get the iTunes guy, Mr. Kirk McElhearn, here to take us through building a lossless iTunes library, whether we should, why we would want to, why maybe we wouldn't want to, and get my questions answered and hopefully some of yours. Kirk, thanks for taking this challenge on.
Thanks for having me again, Chuck. As I was saying just before we started, it's a question I'm getting more and more these days. So it's really quite good timing.
Well, I think it's something that a lot of us who have, I think, as you've said before, who care about music and the quality of the music we listen to, I think we're considering it more than we ever have before because storage is so cheap and it seems to be easier. And of course, the machines have gotten faster, so now ripping a CD doesn't take a substantial amount of time like it used to.
It doesn't change that much because it's not the speed of your computer that affects the ripping speed of a CD. It's more the speed of your drive. I have a Blu-ray drive. It's a Pioneer Blu-ray drive, self-powered USB. It's really good. And I think it rips CDs at 24x. Now, 24x is fairly fast, but back in the day when I had a Mac Pro, an aluminum Mac Pro, the one where you could put two optical drives in, I bought a 52x CD-only drive. Now, they don't make them anymore, and I couldn't even find a standalone external drive faster than 24. You can get some 48x internals, but then I'd need to get an enclosure and a power supply, and I figured it's not worth the hassle.
Right.
So that would make a big difference in the ripping speed, not so much the processor anymore.
And that's interesting because maybe that's what I'm seeing, since I would be ripping most certainly to the Fusion or SSD in one of my computers, and so therefore it feels faster to me. But I never really thought about it. It's the fact that it's the drive that is regulating it.
Yeah, because you might have had, say, a 16x drive in the past. I mean, 24 has sort of been standard for quite a while now. But if you had a slower drive, then maybe you're seeing that difference. There might be a little bit of gain. So on my Retina iMac, which is pretty much top of the line, when I got it a year ago, I got the fastest processor. When I rip a CD, when it gets to the end of a CD, it goes at about 20x, and that's pretty much as fast as it can go. So here's something that you should know when you're ripping a CD in iTunes. At the top of the display is something called the iTunes LCD. That's the thing with the timeline when you're playing music and all that. As it rips a track, it shows how much time is left in ripping, and it shows a number with X. Now, this X, this mythical 1X, goes back to the very first CD-ROM drive. That the initial speed of a CD-ROM drive was 1X, and then a couple years later it was 2X, and then 4X, and they got faster. I think it's 150 something per second. You can look it up. You'll notice that when you start ripping a CD, the speed is slower, and it gets faster as you get to the end of the CD. Now, this is because it starts ripping from the center of the CD, and a CD turns at the same speed all the time. So there's less data for each rotation in the center of the CD than there is in the exterior of the CD. So you're always going to get it starting around 5 or 6 or 8, and then it'll get up to pretty much as high as it can. So in my case, 20, sometimes 22 when it gets to the end of the CD.
Wow. fond memories of going back and optimizing hard drives so that all the data
Yeah.
was in the fastest part of the drive. Gee,
Do you remember the first CD-ROM drives? I bought Apple's first CD-ROM drive. I kid you not, it was about this big, this thick. You look at an internal CD-ROM drive, the size, it's kind of like this. Well, the Apple one was about 1.5 times that in a big, thick aluminum enclosure. And I guess it had SCSI ports in the back. So there was a lot of room for the connectors and all that. It probably weighed about 6 pounds. It came in a box that was literally this big. I mean, the box of the first, I threw out this box 3 years ago when I moved from France to the UK. I still had it. You could fit 3 MacBook Pros inside that box. 3 MacBook Pro boxes inside that box. That's how big it was.
How far we've come. How
Yep.
far we've come. So, Kirk, I know we talked pre-show. I'm going to let you kind of run with the basics of this, but at this point, is it reasonable to start thinking about creating a lossless library or replacing things that I've ripped before with lossless?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So let's begin at the beginning. Let's talk about what compression is. So when you buy a CD, you have basically a piece of plastic with uncompressed digital music on it. This is in a format which is called PCM, pulse code modulation. You don't have PCM files on a Mac or a PC. If you were to rip a CD, you could rip it uncompressed in either AIFF, AIFF, or WAV, WAV format. And what that does is it takes the raw data and sort of wraps it in a header to turn it into a computer file. So you can rip a CD in uncompressed audio, and you'll get exactly the same audio that's on the CD. There won't be a single bit different, assuming that there's not read errors with the CD, of course. Next, you can choose to compress that CD when you rip it, which is what most people do. And there are 2 types of compression. There is lossless compression, which is basically the topic of this show. And there's lossy compression, which everyone is familiar with. MP3s, AAC files, JPEG video, JPEG photos. These are all lossy compression. So for you, what's the difference between lossy and lossless?
Well, I'm not getting everything that I could if I'm using lossy. I'm losing something, and it's gone forever. There's no way to recover it.
Exactly, right. And that gone forever is an interesting point in your question here, and we'll get to that a little bit down the road. So if you rip in a lossless format, and if you rip with iTunes, you can rip in what's called Apple Lossless Format, sometimes abbreviated as ALAC, ALAC, Apple Lossless Audio Codec. What that does is, so let me step back a second and talk about what file compression is versus audio compression. Let's say you've got a Word file on your computer, and it's the text of Shakespeare's Hamlet. You want to compress this file to make it smaller, to store it, to send it to someone. And you want to make sure that when Hamlet says to be or not to be, that is the question, that when you compress it and uncompress it, you don't get to be or not the question. So you want to make sure that every character is there. Generally on a Mac, we use zip compression. And what that does is it looks for basically repetition, redundancies in a file. And it has all sorts of really complicated voodoo of ways that it can sort of shrink. So if it sees something that's redundant, it has a shorthand way of indicating this one appears 3 times at these different places. Basically, it'll shrink all the text in the file, but when you decompress it, you get exactly the same text. So if you're using a lossless compression on audio files, this is exactly what happens. You started with that AIFF or WAV file that was on a CD, the equivalent of the uncompressed music on a CD. You compress it, and when it's played back on the fly, it's uncompressed to be really a bit-for-bit equivalent of what was on the CD. So that's lossless. Now, the advantage of lossless is you have exactly the same quality as the CD in about half the space. If you rip a CD, when you rip as a WAV or an AIFF file, it's 1411 kilobytes per second. If you rip it as a lossless file, it's anywhere from about 400 to 900. It's different according to the music, how loud the music is, how complex it is. If you were to say rip a spoken word, an audiobook, it would compress a lot more than, say, a loud rock band like a Led Zeppelin song or a harpsichord. A harpsichord is a very dense instrument with lots of harmonics. Harmonics are the notes that sort of resonate above the notes. So a harpsichord takes up a lot of space, whereas a piano takes up a lot less. It doesn't have as much complex resonance. So with lossless, you get what you started with.
Okay. So I'm with you. And at the risk of jumping ahead, there is a consideration here when you're picking file formats as to what iTunes can play or support.
Right. So the two most popular lossless formats are, as I mentioned earlier, Apple Lossless and FLAC. FLAC stands for the Free Lossless Audio Codec. It's an open source format, and Apple does not support it. However, all you need to do is convert your FLAC files to Apple Lossless files, and you can play them in iTunes. If you search for iTunes FLAC on my website, you'll find an article explaining how to do this. And I recommend a free app called XLD, X Lossless Decoder, which can do this for you. It's pretty quick. It's a lot faster than ripping CDs. You'll get people who complain that Apple doesn't support FLAC files because they were the sort of standard lossless audio file. But then Apple took their Apple lossless format and turned it into an open source format so anyone can use it. There's no licensing fee or anything like that. If you do buy lossless files by download, and a lot of record labels and websites sell lossless files, you generally have a choice between FLAC and Apple lossless.
Okay, so I want to catch up here for just a second on the conversion part, because we're talking about lossy versus lossless, and so you're saying that if I take a FLAC file and convert it over to Apple Lossless, it is the same as taking the CD, re-ripping it in Apple Lossless.
Exactly. So basically, the conversion process decompresses the file and then recompresses it in a new format. Since it's going from lossless to uncompressed, you're back to square one with what you started with, and the new compression doesn't introduce any difference in quality. Now, this isn't the case with lossy files. So as I said, lossy includes things like MP3 and AAC. The logic behind lossy compression is we want to save space. And of course, this dates back to the early days of MP3 players when you could put maybe one album on a little card in an MP3 player. Space was more important than sound quality at the time. There are a lot of different types of compression mixed in to something like MP3 and AAC, but a lot of it uses what's called psychoacoustics, which essentially replicates the way we hear things in order to remove data that we can't hear. One example, which is actually pretty simple to understand, you know that you've learned in school that a wave looks kind of like this, right? The frequency of a wave indicates the length of the wave. So if you take a 5,000 hertz wave, which would be pretty high treble, that means that there are 5,000 waves per second. The sound is traveling at the same speed no matter what size the wave is. So the waves are closer together. They're very short. If you take a very low wave, like a bass note, very low, say 60 hertz per second, the wave is much longer, okay? One of the tricks in compressing audio files is to take these bass notes and to use what's called joint stereo, where the lowest notes aren't recorded in stereo, they're encoded in mono, because you can't hear the difference. You know, if you have a home theater system with a 5.1, you've only got one subwoofer. It's because the waves are so long that whether it's over here or over here, you can't tell. So this is one way that at the bottom end, they save a little bit of space on the low end of waves. At the top end, they cut off the high frequencies that only your dog can hear. In between, they slice and dice and cut things apart. And if you're at the really low bit rate, so early in the MP3 days, people were trading files like 64 kilobits per second or 96 or 128. And in fact, when the iTunes Store first launched in 2003, their files were 128. You could probably hear a difference between that and a CD. If you do a blind test and you listen and, okay, this sounds a little fuller, a little richer, and this sounds a little thin, right? You'd hear the difference. But once you get up to a higher bit rate, say 256, which is what Apple uses now, it's pretty indistinguishable from a CD. Now, remember, that's 256 compared to 1411. So it's what, about 1/5 the size of the original file.
Okay. So two things I want to make sure we get to while we're at this point. You and I both have music that comes from unofficial sources. So as a result, we see a lot of different formats. We see FLACs. But we also see, I guess you pronounce it ape.ape. We see
Ape.
waves. How do those lossless formats fit into this picture? Is it as simple as using the XLD utility you mentioned to convert those over to AAC?
Yeah. XLD will convert them all. Ape is Monkey's Audio. It's .ape. It's a lossless format. Wave is uncompressed, so any converter will be able to convert that. Shorten, SHN, is another format that was popular for a while. But FLAC is really the most common that you'll see most of the time. This XLD app, I'm telling you, it's the Swiss Army knife. It can read dozens and dozens and dozens of file formats and convert to things you've never heard of. No, it's seriously, it's an extraordinary tool. Hats off to the developer in Japan who makes it. He's pretty low key. He doesn't really advertise. He just gets a lot of people. I think he takes some PayPal donations. So if you use it, give him some yen. But it's been free since forever. And I think that maybe it's around 10 years it's been around now.
Wow.
It's an extraordinary app. It really is. But yeah, you can always convert from any lossless or uncompressed format to any other lossless or uncompressed format. However, and I got this question recently, and it was in my last Ask the iTunes Guy column on Macworld. Someone asked, well, what if I convert my 256K files to lossless? Will they sound better? Well, they won't. So it's hard to explain what this is. Imagine that you've got a glass half full of water and somehow you put it in a thinner glass to fill it up, right? I mean, it's full, but it's still the same amount of water you had in the beginning. So you can convert it to an uncompressed format, which if you burn it to a CD, that's exactly what you do. But the quality won't be the same as uncompressed or lossless. It'll remain that 256K quality.
You've so far avoided or not mentioned the MP3 format.
And MP3, AAC, they're pretty much the same. I mean, AAC is probably slightly better quality, but it's the same logic.
Well, the reason I ask is because when you were talking about ripping a 256 AAC, I've always been told that to get to that same quality with an MP3, I need to rip at 320.
That's the general opinion. I don't think anyone's ever... You can't quantify that. It's all subjective. But that's what most people say. One thing about AAC is if you're ripping at very low bit rates, it's much better quality than MP3. Now, you generally don't want to rip at a low bit rate for music, but you do for spoken word. So if you've got audiobooks and you want to rip them, or my set of Shakespeare plays on CDs, they don't need lossless or 256. 64K is fine because the frequency range of human voice is very, very limited. It only goes up to a couple thousand hertz. So there's no data up at the top end to lose anyway. And AAC really optimizes well for that sort of thing. And in fact, iTunes has a number of settings that you can use, particularly for spoken word, that make it really efficient. But, we come down to the whole storage versus quality discussion here, right?
Well, and taking that out of the equation for a second, and this is just a personal question, but if I have ripped something at 320 MP3, is it beneficial for me to go back and rip it to Apple Lossless or AAC?
It depends on how OCD you are.
That's not fair.
If you want all your files to be Apple Lossless, you can. So here, the first thing you need to do, if you're making this decision, um, again, you'll find an article on my website which explains how you can do a blind test. There's an app you can get from the Mac App Store, a free app. You load 2 files, and it gives you five buttons, and you listen to each one, and you say, this is A and this is B. And then it tells you your results. Back in the day when storage was expensive and iPods didn't hold much, I used to rip at 160. And it was okay. Only sometimes orchestral music, harpsichord, would I really hear the difference between 160 and a CD. Then as the hard drives got cheaper and iPods got more capacity, I moved to 256. I don't hear the difference between that and a CD. Lately, I've been ripping most of my CDs as lossless, and not so much for quality, but because once you've got it in a lossless format, anytime you want to convert it, you will not lose any quality. You'll always be converting from an original, and it's an archival file format in a way. So if you do want to rip to a smaller file size, lower bit rate, you can at any time. But you've got that file that you'll never ever have to rip again. So if I had terabyte hard drives 15 years ago, I would have ripped all my stuff in Apple Lossless, and then I wouldn't have had to re-rip a lot of things that I've re-ripped since then. Basically, I've re-ripped things that I originally ripped at 160, but not 256.
Okay.
So do a blind test. Take a number of different types of music you really, really know well, you're really familiar with. So you know that little cymbal tap or that little squeak on the guitar neck, with the acoustic guitar riffs. Listen on headphones, listen on speakers. And if you can't tell the difference, then, spend your time, I don't know, cleaning up your desk instead.
Ouch. You make a great point, though, about the archival format at some point, because it is it's not a small task to start re-ripping a whole lot of CDs if you have a lot of CDs. And, that we don't want to branch off into this streaming discussion, at least not yet.
Yeah.
But if you have the stuff locally, that may be a worthwhile endeavor to just get all of those CDs into an archival format that is as good as the CD itself.
Exactly. And once you've done that, you can be guaranteed that as long as you back up your files and then back them up again, you can be guaranteed that you'll never have to rip again. That at most you'll have to convert.
This edition of Mac Voices is sponsored by ProXPN, the virtual private network service. Protect your internet by securing your connection, and get up to 50% off by visiting proxpn.com and using the offer code VOICES. It seems we talk a lot about security these days. You can barely open a news website or scroll your Twitter feed without seeing something about hacking, identity theft, surveillance of one kind or another, and a dozen other security-related topics. There are a few ways you can handle this. You can stick your head in the sand and pretend it isn't happening. You can adopt the "it can't happen to me" attitude. Or you can take a few simple steps to reduce your exposure. One of those steps is to sign up with ProXPN, the virtual private network service, so the guy sitting in the corner of the coffee shop isn't tapping into your web surfing habits, or the girl in the next row at the airport isn't recording your passwords as you log into your email, do your online banking, or even shop at Amazon. The team at ProXPN don't log anything, so there are no records for anyone to try to acquire. They don't watch what you do either. In fact, they couldn't if they wanted to, since you're using their 2048-bit encryption key and a 512-bit encryption tunnel. Don't know what that means? No problem. You don't have to. Just know that you're safe and secure and no one is watching what you do or where you do it. I hear from way too many people who say, "But I have nothing to hide." Of course you do. Credit card numbers, logins to company websites and email accounts, your brokerage account, your bank account. Even online shopping accounts can be problematic if you've saved credit card numbers there. You could find yourself paying for an 80-inch TV that you never ordered, or even worse, a PC that you never would have ordered. All that and more can be avoided if you just go to proxpn.com right now and sign up for a free account. No credit card necessary. Try ProXPN and find out how easy it is to use on your Mac. Find out how good it feels to know you're safe and secure when you tap into any public Wi-Fi hotspot. Discover how much you like knowing that no one is tracking you, that no one can track you, Then take it up a notch and sign up using the code VOICES to get up to 50% off a premium account to get unlimited VPN speed. Get all the ports open so you can do whatever you want with no restrictions, support for your mobile devices, and a host of other features. That's ProXPN and the code VOICES for up to 50% off their premium level service. Give it a try and let me know how much you like being secure. I'm Chuck at MacVoices.com. Thanks to ProXPN for their support of MacVoices.
Now, one thing to point out, so we're talking file size versus quality. We're talking storage versus audio quality. So here are a couple of variables you need to consider. Where do you listen to your music? If you listen on a stereo at home, a good stereo, I'm in my office, I've got a Denon amplifier and CD player, I've got vocal chorus speakers. I have a stereo to listen to my music, not little computer speakers. So my music sounds quite good in here. But if you're just listening on a little Bluetooth speaker or something, or little speakers plugged into your computer, it's really not worth it. You'll be wasting space and you'll be wasting time. The other thing is, if you're listening outdoors, you will never hear the difference between a lossless file and a compressed file outdoors. So Apple Music streams at 256K, which is pretty high actually for mobile. Spotify streams at 96, unless you're a paid subscriber and you turn on the high quality option, and then you get 320, I think. But if you're outdoors, there's background noise. There's, your headphones aren't great. You're simply not going to hear the difference. And it's a waste of time, and it's a waste of storage on your iPhone or whichever device you're using. Another thing to remember is if you do rip to lossless in iTunes and you're syncing to, say, an iPhone, there's a setting where you can have iTunes automatically convert files that you copy to your iOS device at either 128, 192, or 256K. So for me, all my lossless files get converted to 256 on my iPhone when I sync. So a file that's, let's say, an album that's taking up 400 megabytes in my iTunes library is only taking up 100 megabytes on my iPhone. So you can have the best of both worlds. You can have the lossless files on your computer in your iTunes library, and you can have the lossy files automatically converted on your iOS device for portable listening.
But that's a hardwired sync.
Or a Wi-Fi sync.
Or a Wi-Fi sync. Okay.
Yeah, it works with both.
Okay.
And so if you've got, I don't know, a few thousand songs and you're doing it the first time, it's going to take a while because it's converting it on the fly. But when you do subsequent syncs and you're only updating a handful of songs, it's very quick.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, I don't let me get ahead of us because I want to make sure that we keep everything straight. But at some point, we have to get into the discussion of iTunes Match and iCloud.
Yep. As
to where your music is being stored, how it's being stored, and can we have a problem with that? As far as something getting overwritten or changed or modified. And I know we've talked about some of that before, but I think it's especially relevant if we're talking about lossless files and things that, you don't want to have to go back and re-rip in the event that iTunes Match or something else messes them up.
Yeah, so remember before I said make sure you make a backup and a second backup.
Yeah.
If you're using iTunes Match and you've got lossless files in your library, iTunes does one of two things. It matches the files, and it matches them to files in the iTunes store, or it uploads the files. But if it uploads them, it converts them to 256K, so it doesn't use up too much space. So when you then stream those files or download them to a different device, they're all going to be 256K no matter what. So if you've got your main iTunes library on one Mac and it's in lossless, you won't have lossless on your other devices. Let's say you've got a Mac at home, a Mac at work. If you want to have lossless files on both, you need to copy the files onto a portable drive and move them to your other Mac. And again, of course, Apple's being logical here, not letting you stream lossless files. It'll cost you a fortune in data charges. And unless you're streaming to, say, an Apple TV in the living room, then you won't have the quality. As I said earlier, if you're outside on your iPhone, the background noise is going to negate any benefit that you might have from the better quality. Now, of course, if you do use an Apple TV in the living room, it would be better to use home sharing and stream from your local library than to stream from the cloud, because then, assuming you've got a good stereo in your living room, you've got your better quality files that come from your iTunes library rather than coming from the cloud.
I'm sure we've confused some people here, but I think if you go back and listen, folks, a couple times carefully,
this is maybe one episode that might be worth listening to twice. There are a lot of things going on here, a lot of variables. I mean, let's say the first variable is, can you hear the difference? If not, we can make a flow chart. If not, go to end. No. Clean your desk, go gardening, whatever. Okay, you can hear the difference. You've got good stereo equipment. Is it worth the time of re-ripping everything? Or maybe you want to re-rip some of your music. You know, the music you really like that you listen to a lot. Remember, it's not an all or nothing project here. And it's something that you do over time. You're not going to spend, a week, 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day in front of your computer ripping CDs, though there have been times when... Well, that last 80 CD box set of live Grateful Dead concerts, I did that pretty much in a week while I was working. I'd put a CD in, I'd fix the tags, rip it, do my work. When it was finished, I'd put another one in. But it's a long-term project. It requires a commitment. It requires, please, 2 backups, not just 1, 2. Because, all the time you spend on this, if you don't have backups and you lose it.
Yeah. You've lost it.
Yeah, you have lost it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, interesting that you bring up tags, because that was something else I wanted to get into. When we're doing the conversions we were talking about from, say, a FLAC file over, or when we are just ripping straight from the CD to our iTunes library, how is the album art being handled? And I'm thinking album art mainly because we all know, the tags can come pretty much, I think, consistently. The album art, though, is sort of another matter.
Well, I find that I probably have to do some editing of tags on about half of the CDs I rip.
Really?
So, for instance, these Grateful Dead CDs, some of them, the tags come back with, after each song name, live at such and such venue, such and such date. Well, I put that in the album name. I don't need that with the name of the track, right? Some of them have composers. I don't want composers for rock music. And okay, the OCD part, I want to tag my live music year-month-day, right? So 1969-03-02, and then the name of the venue, so I can look at things in order. So all of that requires some massaging. The album artwork, and that's a good example. This is something that's not available on the iTunes store, so I had to find the album artwork online and add it manually. Depending on what you're ripping, you may or may not get album artwork from the iTunes store. You need to search Google and generally find, the best file you can. And of course, another question here, quality versus size. Be careful. You might download an album artwork file that's like 5 megabytes, and you've got 10 tracks and that's 50 megabytes. Use an image editor, make it smaller. I make all my artwork 600 pixels square, which is the size that the iTunes store uses. I find that it shows up well on an iPhone, on an Apple TV, but it doesn't take up too much space. So if you have a really big file, downsample it a bit with an image editor.
Yeah, that's a great point. That because you don't realize that you are applying that album art to
every file,
that many tracks. Yeah.
It's not. The album art isn't just applied to the album as a unit, but to each individual track. So if you've only got one track in a playlist, the album art's there.
Okay. Kirk, a couple of the answers you've given have kind of changed my way of thinking about this and understanding how it works. One of the questions I was going to ask you, and I'll ask it anyway, because we've talked about this, how you have multiple libraries and you keep for example, you don't let iTunes touch or iTunes Match touch some libraries. How do you manage multiple libraries? And the reason I was thinking about it was I thought, okay, maybe I'll have a lossless library over here to listen to at home, and then an MP3 or AAC version library to listen to on the go. But you've kind of taken that away from me because I don't need to. Apple and iTunes and iCloud do it magically for me.
Yeah. So I actually have 3 separate libraries, 2 on my iMac and 1 on my MacBook. My main library is on my iMac, and there's a second one there of music I don't listen to a lot. One of the things I do is I review classical CDs. So I've got thousands of CDs in the house, and I rip pretty much everything when I review it. And if I'm not interested, I don't need to keep it in my library. But I'm not going to throw out the files because I've ripped the CDs. So I put them in another library. If you want to make a second library, as soon as the easiest way to do it is with the iTunes icon in the dock. Click the iTunes icon and immediately press the Option key. And iTunes displays a dialog which says, to be exact, choose iTunes library. You can either choose a library, create a library, or quit. So you can make a second library or a third or as many as you want. And in order to switch libraries, you just do the same thing. You launch iTunes, press the Option key, and you choose a different library. So again, I've got my main library staying around 70,000 tracks, my secondary library about 40,000. And on my MacBook is a totally separate library because I don't trust Apple Music and the cloud with my music. It's already borked my music once when it first launched. So it's purely a test library where almost everything is music I've added from Apple Music. The only reason I've done this is because I write about this stuff and I need to be able to use iTunes Match and Apple Music. So this library is not something I listen to often, except when I'm listening to Apple Music. But it's not my music in general. So I add some albums to it that are mine, but most is things that I've added from Apple Music. But that's an exception. That's really, that's me professional here. This said, and I've said this in many articles and probably on this show, if you've got a carefully curated iTunes library, don't let iCloud Music Library touch it. It'll change tags, it'll change artwork, it'll change artist genres, song names. It's just disastrous.
Yeah, I've had that happen. I know Jim Dalrymple has famously.
Yeah. You've
had it. I think everybody has had it. That if you pay attention to what's going on.
Yeah. Now you can use Apple Music without iCloud Music Library. In iTunes General Preferences, you can just check the Apple Music box, but not the iCloud Music Library box. And what this lets you do is go to New for You and find something and play it, listen to radio stations and all that. But what you can't do is add anything to your library. Now, if all you want to do is stream the occasional album and you know what you want, then that's a good solution. The other option would be, well, you could make a second library. Now, how would that work? You can't do that in iTunes anymore. If you make a second library, you can't have one library where iCloud Music Library is turned on and the other where it's turned off, because that's a global preference for your iTunes instance. You used to be able to do that. There was a hack a few years ago where you could have totally different preferences, but it doesn't work anymore. So if you really want an iCloud Music Library and an iTunes library, the only ways you could do it is you've got your iTunes library, your canonical library on your Mac, and let's say you've got an iOS device, and you make an iCloud Music Library on that one, but make sure you don't sync it to your Mac. See, you need multiple devices if you want to get this to work.
And I think you just answered it, but I'm gonna state my question and be very clear about it. So if I create a rock library and I create a jazz library, and keep the two separate because it just seems to make sense, then I have to choose not to use one of those with iCloud, or it will merge them?
Good question. I've never tested, but yes, it should merge them. So what would happen is, let's say you've got your rock library open and you haven't turned on iCloud Music Library. You open your jazz library and you turn on iCloud Music Library. It's going to match everything in your jazz library. When you go back to your rock library, iCloud Music Library is going to be on, because again, that's a global setting in iTunes, and it's going to start matching your rock library and pull down your jazz library. So the only way you could avoid that is to make sure that you turn off your internet or your Wi-Fi before you open iTunes, then go in and uncheck the setting, and then you're safe. But really, do you want to bother with a workaround like that?
Yeah, that's not really.
Yeah.
Not really.
So here's one thing that I do, which is a really good tip. So I have an iPod Touch, and I use it for testing. I use it for testing iOS betas, and I use it for iCloud Music Library. I have my MacBook, which has an iCloud Music Library. But sometimes I want to listen to this music through my iMac and my stereo system. There's an app you can buy from Rogue Amoeba called Airfoil Speakers, which basically turns any Mac into an AirPlay device. So I can go into iTunes on my MacBook, click on the little AirPlay icon, select my iMac, play the music on my MacBook, it goes through my iMac into my stereo. Or I can play it on my iPod Touch and AirPlay it to my iMac through my stereo. So I've got the best of both worlds. I've got my good quality audio system, and I'm not putting my main iTunes library at risk.
Folks, I think you need to listen to this show 3 times. The first time to absorb, the second time to take notes, the third time to do diagrams. Because that one...
Yeah, it's, remember back in the day, you'd rip your CDs, you'd play them, you'd sync them, you'd burn them to a CD. It was all easy. Once they brought the cloud in, they complicated things so much. And, frankly, I'm sitting here, I'm more used to writing about this than talking about all the detail of this kind of stuff. And I'm realizing how complex it's become as I hear myself explaining, which I don't really see when I'm writing. You've got paragraphs and headers, and you can lay it out in a certain way. In my Take Control of iTunes book, you got chapters, you got sections and questions and answers. But trying to explain it, there's no way I could have given this explanation in 5 minutes, because there are so many things you need to know now if you care about music. Of course, a lot of people don't care the same way. They've got their Apple Music or Spotify subscription. They listen to music and they love it, and more power to them.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, Apple has added a lot of convenience, because now you can listen to your library anywhere. But it also means that there's a level of complexity. That's the price you pay for it. So. Yeah,
it's complexity. It's uncertainty. It's one example I wrote about a month or so ago on my website. There's a 4 or 5 disc set of Frank Sinatra songs. It was just Frank's 100th birthday or whatever. And I downloaded this. I think it's called Ultimate Sinatra. And I downloaded this into my iCloud Music Library on my MacBook. And the next day, that album wasn't there, but 8 other albums were there, that the tracks that were downloaded got subsequently matched to different tracks by different artists. So they weren't Frank Sinatra. They had different covers, and it was just a mess. And that shouldn't happen. So you've got the problem of matching. You've got the problem of maintaining tags. You may have... Let's say one of my favorite movies is Almost Famous. Do you know that?
No, I do not.
Oh,
sorry.
You go out now and you're going to see you're going to buy the extended version, because the short version is not as good. Okay. It's a Cameron Crowe movie. It's basically about his experience as a young writer writing about rock music and going on tour with bands in the 70s. So it's got a soundtrack of a dozen songs, great songs from the 70s. Allman Brothers, Elton John, all sorts of stuff. If you were to put that CD into the iCloud Music Library, maybe a couple of the songs will match the soundtrack album. Maybe a couple will match the original albums that the songs were on. Maybe a couple will match greatest hits albums. And you won't have your album together again. Now, you can change it, but iCloud Music Library will probably eventually change it back to the way it thinks it should be. And this is just wrong. It just shouldn't happen like this. But seriously, Chuck, if you have not seen Almost Famous, this is one of the best movies ever.
I'm sorry, because I know Cameron Crowe's name well, so I don't know how I've missed this. And
get the long version,
okay?
Because it's like 20 minutes longer, and it's really it's just, I can't say how good this is.
All right, I'll be looking for it tonight. Believe me.
The the key line, I need to go home. You are home.
Yeah. Today's edition of Mac Voices is sponsored by Smile, the makers of PDF Pen for Mac, PDF Pen Pro for Mac, PDF Pen for iPhone and iPad, PDF Pen Scan Plus for iPhone and iPad, Text Expander for Mac, Text Expander for iPhone and iPad, and Disk Label. Find out more about all their great products at smilesoftware.com. With the arrival of iPad Pro, the long-running discussion of the iPad as laptop replacement has been rekindled, with all sorts of new fuel on the fire. I'll leave at least part of that discussion for another time, but what I do want to point out to you is that no matter what Apple platform you decide to use, Smile has you covered with versions of their killer apps for both. Text Expander is a must-have app that lets you create snippets of text that expand into anything you like. Corrected or specified words with the correct capitalization, paragraphs of boilerplate text, HTML code, and much more. Text Expander can take text from your clipboard and manipulate it, changing case, changing format, and a lot more. Or you can trigger OS X automation if you need to. Create forms for others to fill out. The list goes on and on. And Text Expander for iPhone and iPad bring that functionality to your iOS devices and now to the iPad Pro, so you can keep the productivity train rolling. Better still, by using Dropbox or iCloud, all of your snippets created on one platform are automatically synced with the other. No recreating, copying, or other maintenance necessary. Just clean, simple, smooth productivity. The way you like it. The way it should be. The Smile way. Why not find out just how much time and effort Text Expander can save you by downloading a free trial at smilesoftware.com. Take it for a spin and discover the power tool that so many of us have been benefiting from for years. PDF Pen and PDF Pen Pro are also available for both the Mac and iOS platforms, but that's a story for another time. For now, visit smilesoftware.com, try out Text Expander for free, and tell them you heard about it on Mac Voices. Oh, and while you're there, take a few minutes to check out the spiffy new Smile website. You're seeing some of it here, but there's a lot more to explore. That's smilesoftware.com for some of the best productivity apps for Macs, iPhones, and iPads of all shapes and sizes. Thanks to Smile for being the longest-running sponsor of Mac Voices. Kirk, I'm just looking at my list of questions, and sort of so I'm going to jump around here because there are just a couple things that we haven't touched on.
Sure.
For folks that are downloading FLAC files, lossless files from somewhere other than iTunes, or have them, or whatever, sometimes you'll see all these crazy little files that you've never seen before, Q files and other files. Sometimes the FLAC files will come down like you would expect from a CD with individual tracks. Sometimes they come down as the whole darn album in one big file. That, of course,
with the Q file.
Right. That, of course, plays straight through, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Any feelings or thoughts on that particular issue and how to address it?
Yeah, so a Q file is a .cue file, which basically tells an application where one track starts and where it ends. It's like a table of contents. And as you say, the FLAC file can be a single album. You'll also see this with Monkey's Audio.ape files. It can be a single album. So if you have in one folder your FLAC file and your Q file, and you double-click or you drag the Q file onto the XLD icon, XLD will detect the FLAC file, and it can split as you convert into the individual files. So the Q file is used either for splitting that file or for recreating it if you're burning a CD. Now, I can't remember the last time I burned a CD. Certainly not this decade. So that's not really the issue. As to why people do it, I think this is something people did back before we had gapless playback. So what that means is that if you've got two tracks that run together, say a live album, an opera or something, back in the day you would have a little bit of a bump, a tiny little half-second, quarter-second gap as it switched from one to another, but you don't get that anymore. So if you were listening to, I don't know, Pink Floyd's The Wall or Tommy or any operas, you wouldn't want to have those gaps between the tracks, and putting all the files in a single file meant you could play it back like that. But I don't really see many of those anymore. Pretty much every time I see FLAC files, they're individual files now.
Okay, that's good. Because I've run across a couple of those. It's like, okay, now what do I do with this?
Yeah.
I've done some experimentation and figured it out. But it just is kind of a surprise. You think, wow,
Yep.
why do they do this? The live album and opera thing make perfect sense.
Yeah.
Kirk, what other landmines are there to going down this path? Anything that you can think of? I mean, we've pointed out, I think, some, and I don't know that they're landmines; they're just considerations. But any reason we wouldn't want to do this?
Well, as I said, if you can't hear the difference between your lossy compressed file and the original, you could be spending an awful lot of time for something that won't bear any fruit. Now, if you do want to save an archival file, by all means, it's worth it. But if you're doing this for a quality difference, make sure you can hear that quality difference first. Other than that, the real landmine is the time it'll take. It depends on the size of your CD collection. I think you and me, we'd have to take a year off to be able to re-rip all our CDs. I've gone through and re-ripped some of the ones, as I said, that were 160, things I listen to a lot, things I really like. But I just can't do everything. Lots of my music is stuff I got by download, iTunes Store, when I used to be a member of eMusic, and masses of classical music that I get by download, to review, and record labels I know who send me all their files and stuff. So I've got a lot of stuff that I just wouldn't bother, that I really wouldn't care about getting in lossless. It's just a question of, how much of a difference does it make to you? If it's going to make you feel better, then I'd say do it. If it's an excuse to not clean your desk off, then I'd say do it. I'm going to rib you about it, because it's like that desk behind you is like it's my desk, but no one can see my desk.
Yeah. My desk is everybody's desk, but they don't see it. Yeah.
Well, almost everybody's.
Yeah.
I've seen some people with clean desks, and it makes me wonder about them a bit.
Yeah. You talk about OCD. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that, I think, is one of the things that a lot of us are going to have to fight, that might be considering this, is trying to figure out, does it really make a difference? How much time do you want to spend managing your library versus actually enjoying and listening to your library? So,
yeah, and then you get into the whole, if you go down that rabbit hole, then you can start down the audiophile rabbit hole and start worrying about, which cables you use, and then you go into high resolution files, and are your speakers good enough? No, got to get better speakers, got to get a new DAC, and it eats you up. Great article I came across the other day. So I have this sort of occasional series on my website, and the first article in the series was how hi-fi magazines write about cables, because I was writing about some ridiculous review about cables, how great they sound. And I think I'm up to part 18, and I just kept the title because the title kind of summarizes it. So there's an article that I haven't written about yet, but I will maybe tomorrow. A couple guys sit down and they try and explain the difference between the audio quality they get from listening to music off different hard drives. That this hard drive sounds better than that hard drive.
Okay.
And they're very serious about this. There's a big thing, audiophiles. So these are people who are obsessed with audio quality and all that. Many of these people believe, and they will swear to you, that they have heard the difference, that one USB cable does not sound like another USB cable, even though it's sending the same digital information. And they'll talk about a warmer sound and a brighter soundscape and all that, which is just physically impossible, because the sound doesn't get converted until it gets to the DAC, the digital analog converter. So here we are with hard drives, and they're talking about hard drives, but they're not really talking about the different enclosures or the buses between the drives and the cables and everything else. They're just saying it's the hard drives. That like an SSD sounds better than a 5900 RPM hard drive because whatever. So don't fall down that rabbit hole. Enjoy your music. It's made for enjoying.
And if you start down there, just remember, a 1 is a 1, a 0 is a 0. That's it.
That's it. A 1 can't become a 0 can't become a 1. There is the possibility of, there's something called bit rot. That your files over time, they can actually change as you copy them to different drives. If you've got a sector that's bad, if a bit doesn't get read correctly, and over time, copies and copies and copies, it's not quite like Xerox copies of Xerox copies. But people who are professionals who archive digital data, they're very concerned about this. They need to make sure that there's no bit rot. You mentioned earlier that sometimes with FLAC files you get additional files, and one of them is a .md5 file. And that actually, it's what's called a checksum that you can use to verify that the original FLAC file is the same as the one you've got, right? So there's a way of, you run the thing and it counts something and it compares to the signature in the MD5 file. And this is really important for archivists who are worried about keeping files over time. So a 1 can become a 0 if there's a problem with a hard drive or something like that, but it's just not going to affect the soundscape of your music or the warmth of your, you don't hear the third oboe in Mahler's Third Symphony better on an SSD than you do on a hard drive.
And you don't lose the third oboe because of a 1 going to a 0.
Absolutely not.
Kirk, this has been fascinating. It's answered a lot of my questions. Hopefully it's answered some for some other people that are considering this, or maybe now they will consider it. Especially, I was really impressed because I'm embarrassed to say I did not know that if I took a lossless file, put it on my hard drive, and sent it to iCloud Music, that it would convert it to an AAC.
Yeah.
And then that's what comes back down streaming. That makes perfect sense. But,
yeah, because so what iCloud Music Library does is it tries to match your files, and iTunes match as well. And it's not going to match lossless because Apple doesn't have lossless files on the iTunes store. I'll tell you a secret, though. They do have lossless files. They even have high-resolution lossless files. And this is what they store as their archival files. Now, many people have been wondering, when is Apple going to start selling lossless files? Here's the problem. If they do, they're going to say it's better quality, but then they're going to say that Apple Music and iTunes Store regular stuff is lesser quality. So there's a marketing issue there. I think maybe 1% of people really care about buying lossless files, so I don't think it's something that's going to happen soon. But Apple does have, they get 24-bit 96 kilohertz high-resolution files for almost everything that they sell, and then it's converted. So they do have lossless files. If they ever want to start selling them, it would take a while to convert them. They probably have a way to do it on the fly the first time someone buys one, but it's possible. But for now, they don't have lossless files, so they can't match your lossless files to their lossless files.
So we still have another grade or two to go up if you are OCD about your music. Yeah,
but see, high-resolution music is, it's good for your dog because he can hear the high frequencies, but you can't. I'm pretty negative about this because you get a lot of self-serving people like Neil Young when he launched his Pono music player, a year and a half ago, and he came out and said that 90% of musical data is lost in an MP3 file, which is just rubbish. It's not true. It's self-serving. It's him trying to sell his product. A lot of the companies who are selling high-resolution files sell them for twice as much as regular files, which is ridiculous. There are other companies who sell them for maybe $1 or $2 more. I think Bruce Springsteen sells live concerts now, and I think it's $2 more for FLAC compared to MP3, and they might have some high-resolution files, maybe another $2 more. If you won't hear the difference. If you got a $50,000 stereo, you might hear the difference, or even a $20,000 stereo. But the people who think they can hear the difference think they can also hear the difference between an SSD and a hard drive, or will test two separate Ethernet cables between their network-attached storage device and their whatever's playing their music, and find that one sounds better than the other.
Yeah. Lots of examples of that kind of thing.
But, there are lots of things in the world like that. Look at people who are into cars, right?
Oh, sure.
You get into, I personally couldn't care less about cars. I like having a comfortable car that's safe, and that's it. But I remember when I was young, people would tune up their cars. They'd pour STP into the carburetor. It's like, why? It's just going from here to there. It doesn't,
Yeah. What can you say? We all have our thing. And
so it's interesting. Just before the show, we were talking about podcast microphones, right? I'm talking my microphone I usually use is out of service, and I'm talking on an inline microphone on a Sennheiser headset, which is not a very expensive headset. And as you said, it sounds fine. And some people spend hundreds of dollars on a podcast microphone because it's like you belong to a tribe and you want to have the accoutrements of the tribe. No, this is really what it is.
No, that's true. That's a good point. I've never heard it expressed that way, but that's a good point.
But yeah, you get into something that you do, a craft, a hobby, whatever it is. You start learning the language. You start learning the customs and all that, the way people, the things that people buy that other people would never heard of. Do you know what the game of Go is?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
I've been playing Go for about 30 years, and I don't play very much anymore, but I mostly play online. Nevertheless, about 15 years ago, I bought a very nice Go board and handmade stones and all that from Japan. And once every few years, I take it out and play with a friend or something. It's just because it's a thing. It's the tribe. The tribe has to have, the handmade stones. It's part of the thing. So.
So the website, your website, is Kirkville at McElhearn.com, excuse me.
McElhearn.com, McElhearn.com.
Right. And there's all kind of this stuff all over Kirk's blog. He is the iTunes guy for Macworld at Macworld.com. And Kirk, is it iTunes a Take Control Crash Course? Or is it Take Control of iTunes?
Take Control of iTunes.
Take Control of iTunes. Okay.
Take Control of iTunes 12, the FAQ. It's the only book that we've done in a sort of frequently asked question format. So it's questions and answers.
That's right. So there's also a lot of this stuff there as well. Not necessarily specifically Lossless, but just iTunes.
No, I do discuss Lossless. I don't go into as much detail as what we just did.
Yeah.
And I also have an iTunes forum. It's at forum.mcelhearn.com.
Oh.
I launched that about 6 months ago, and it's getting a lot of interesting traffic. So if you're really iTunes obsessed, come on over, because there are a lot of other iTunes obsessed people with questions and answers. And the thing is, music is important to us, and iTunes is one of the things. It's our tool for storing, organizing, and listening to music. And it's really frustrating when something doesn't work. So it's good to have a place like that to ask a question and to see how other people resolve their issues.
Oh yeah, and maybe not just iTunes obsessed, but iTunes confused.
Yeah, that too.
Go and I did not know about that. That's great. I will check that out. I was not aware of that.
Yep.
Last thing, we'll hit. Where do we find you on the social media?
On Twitter, I'm at McElhearn, McElhearn, and I've got a Facebook page. You can get to it from my website. I actually don't know what the URL is. It might just be facebook.com/Kirk McElhearn or something like that.
Okay, great. Kirk, thanks so much for the time and for all the wisdom. I think a lot of questions got answered. I'm sure there'll be some others that come up, and maybe we can do a follow-up at some point along with another iTunes topic. Sure,
and I hope I didn't confuse too many people. As Chuck said, listen a couple of times, make notes, and if you have questions, go over to the iTunes forum and ask them. You'll find a lot of people who can help as well.
Great. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me again, Chuck.
Thank you. Folks, thank you for joining us. This one really is one. I've meant it. Go and listen 2 or 3 times, take some notes, make some diagrams, make sure you understand if you care about music. And if you don't, great, just hit play and go for it. Until the next time, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is MacVoices. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, Google+, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the MacVoices blog. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the MacVoices Dispatch, to stay up to date on all the latest MacVoices news from our front page or at macvoices.com/newsletter. Do more with your Apple tech by subscribing to the free MacVoices magazine on Flipboard by visiting macvoices.com/magazine. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.